Okay, hello everybody. It's Diane Yantel. I'm President and CEO of the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Thank you for joining today's call on coronavirus and housing and homelessness. As always, we have a very large call today, lots of participants. I think we have nearly 2,000 people registered. And as always, we have a broad spectrum of participants, including people who are experiencing homelessness, low-income renters, federal, state, and local policymakers, housing and homelessness service providers. We have organizers, advocates, foundations on the line, and we have a number of reporters on the line as well. Thank you for sending questions in advance. We'll do our best to get those questions answered throughout the call from our speakers. And I also want to, before we turn to our speaker, to share some updates on materials that the National Income Housing Coalition has been producing. And the first set of them relate to the questions that you all have been sending on these calls. So we have now on our website, on the COVID-19 page on the National Income Housing Coalition's website, you'll find a set of FAQs that we have been pulling from the questions that are being asked on these webinars and elsewhere, and doing our best to answer those questions. So there's FAQs now up on our website that are related to coronavirus and homelessness, economic impact payments, unemployment insurance, renters' rights, and FEMA resources. So you'll find FAQs on each of those topics on our website. We're working on getting those translated into Spanish, and we'll be putting those up as we're able to, and we'll be continuing to produce more FAQs as the week and the weeks go on. Also wanted to remind you on our website that you can find a list of local eviction and foreclosure moratoriums that we're tracking. We're also tracking all state and local emergency rental assistance programs, and you'll find that on our website too. Please take a look at that, and if we're missing some that you know of, let us know so we can add those to our tracking. We're also tracking shelter closings, so the number of homeless shelters that have had to close due to lack of resources from COVID-19. So you can find that on our website too. I want to ask and encourage everybody to continue to widely share the searchable database and the map that we created that allows for renters to find out if their property is covered by national eviction moratoriums. Just a reminder that the data in that tool are not comprehensive, which is maybe something more Calabria will talk about in a moment, but it's a very good start. And we've already heard of at least 24 illegal evictions that were prevented after renters and legal aid attorneys were able to use that tool. So please keep using and please keep sharing that tool widely. Wanted to make sure that you're aware of a webinar that we held last week. It was hosted by two campaigns that the National Income Housing Coalition leads, the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding and the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition. And the webinar was on funding in the CARES Act, and specifically funds related to homelessness and affordable housing. And we had partners from National Housing Law Project, Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, National Alliance to End Homelessness, National League of Cities, Centers for Disability Rights, and others, and together shared information on all of the funding that was appropriated in the CARES Act and on the importance of centering racial equity and equity for all marginalized people in the use of these response and recovery funds. So you can find a link to that webinar on our website, and you can watch it when you're able to. Also a reminder that we'll continue to hold these large national calls each Monday, and we have a number of smaller working group calls that allow for more discussion and peer-to-peer learning and sharing. So some of the upcoming calls include Tenant Talk Live, which happens tonight at 6 o'clock. That's for low-income renters and resident leaders. We have our regular legislative working group call tomorrow at 12:30. Where we'll continue to talk about how we achieve our policy priorities, including the $100 billion for rental assistance. Also tomorrow and every Tuesday at 3 o'clock, we have a Working with FEMA working group, where we're continuing to discuss best practices and challenges in working with FEMA to fund non-congregate shelter for people experiencing homelessness. So tomorrow we're going to share what our team has learned after really digging in and reviewing every state's disaster declaration, requests to FEMA, responses from FEMA. There's a number of discrepancies in how FEMA is approving funding for this purpose. So we'll talk about ways that together we can push FEMA to do more and to do it more uniformly. And then on Wednesday, we have our state and local implementation working group. That's at 3 o'clock on Wednesdays. This week, we're going to talk about state and local programs and protections for undocumented immigrants. And we're going to talk about ways that nonprofit housing, advocacy, or developer organizations are using SBA loans, and the latest on HUD, USDA, Treasury waivers, and guidance, both what currently exists and what's needed. So you can find a way to register for all of those calls. I believe some of the team are going to put those in the chat box now, and you can go to our website and sign up for any of those. So I'm going to turn now to our agenda, which as always is full of fantastic speakers. And I'm going to start with some federal updates, and we are very pleased to have on the call today Mark Calabria, who is the director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, or FHFA. And Mark has joined us to talk about some of the changes that they've implemented to protect renters during the pandemic. So Director Calabria, I'll turn it over to you. Mark or Daniela, are you there? Are you on from FHFA? Okay, if you're on, you might be muted and we can't hear you.
Hey Diane, this is Sarah. I'm just letting you know that Mark got in touch with us and is having some technical issues, so we'll try to work with him to get him squared up.
Okay. In that case, I'm going to turn to our next speaker. So we're also delighted to have on the line. Hello, was that Mark?
Yeah, Diane, are you hearing me now?
Great. Yes, I can hear you. Terrific.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
Sorry about that. Okay, apologies, technical issues. Again, thank you for everything that you're doing, and thank you really for all of your effort here. I'm going to talk for about 5 to 6 minutes, answer a couple of your questions, and see if we can try to get a little more detail there. And really, let me thank you for this opportunity as well. I'll start out by reminding everybody that FHFA is the independent regulator for Fannie and Freddie, as well as the Federal Home Loan Banks. Very early on in this crisis, I'll note weeks before the CARES Act was passed, FHFA directed the enterprises to put in place a number of protections, working through their business partners, the mortgage servicers predominantly, and this is how we are providing relief both to renters and landlords. I do want to emphasize at the beginning, one of our hooks into this, if you will, with landlords, and our relationship is with the mortgagor, the person who holds the mortgage. So it's why we have a relationship via the enterprises with homeowners, with landlords, but not a contractual relationship with tenants, which gives us some flexibility, but also limits some of our ability to be able to make some requirements on the landlords. So again, want to emphasize that's our hook through this. We don't own the properties, we don't manage the properties, but we do oversee those who are engaged in the mortgages. Should start out saying, just give you a sense of where we are in the market. Fannie and Freddie do have about just over 40% of the multifamily market. So this is 8.6 million households overall. We have tried to set standards that we think others in the marketplace could adopt and hopefully get there. We've seen a lot of that on the single family side, where much of what we've put out has been adopted by the rest of the market. And we've been coordinating with FHA and others in the multifamily side, of course, encouraging them to adopt the same standards that we're putting in place, so that we can try to make sure that all homeowners, all renters get treated similarly, regardless of who owns their mortgage. But again, really the emphasis here is remembering and focusing on that this is a public health crisis. We want to make sure that no one is put out of their house in this instance. And I'll remind you, I think, as you know, there were a number of families that were facing foreclosure even pre-virus. So for those families, we made sure that if they were in a Fannie Freddie owned property, that there would be no eviction during the national emergency, that all of that was put on hold regardless of whether it was related to the virus either way. Also wanted to make sure that any single family, any homeowner who's had a loss of income or hardship would be able to get forbearance. And I take it that we were somewhat along the right direction because Congress largely, with some modest differences, took what we were doing at FHFA and put that into the CARES Act. Reminds you that the forbearance in this case, whether it's in the single family or the multifamily, suspends or reduces mortgage payments, waives penalties, and late fees. At the end of the forbearance period, borrowers and mortgage servicers will set up a repayment plan or modify the loan. So again, I want to emphasize, again, whether it's single family or multifamily, this is forbearance. It will have to be paid back at one point, but I do want to clarify something because I think there's been a lot of confusion in the press and the media, whether it's the single family, whether it's the multifamily. There will be no lump sum required at the end of the forbearance period. So again, for homeowners who've gone into forbearance for a number of months, they will not be required for Fannie and Freddie loans to pay it back at the same time. It will also not be the case for landlords as well. I do want to emphasize that our single family program, as you remember, about a third of renters live in single family properties where they are either, and again, that is an allowable forbearance under our single family program, and we've seen significant uptake in that, and again, where that's been passed along to renters. Also, we wanted to make sure, and again, what we did on the single family program was built upon what we have done in previous disasters. So much of what was done in the case of hurricanes, other natural disasters, we took that framework, built that out on the single family side. I'll emphasize what we're doing on the multifamily side has never been done before. So again, it's been a little more learning, I would say, involved in trying to make sure that this works, make sure that it's something that is effective and is reaching the people it needs to be put in place. But again, I want to emphasize, because this is something that was created from scratch, there's been a little bit more learning. It's taken a little longer for there to be uptake, and then make sure that there's forbearance. And again, to emphasize how this works on the rental side, if you are a renter, and to get to your question earlier, we are in the process today, while there is a single family lookup tool that you can figure out whether your mortgage is held by Fannie and Freddie. That's because we have the mortgagers, the homeowners information. We obviously don't have the information for the tenant, but we have address information. We are in the process of developing a rental lookup tool where a renter could go in, enter their address, and they would get a yes or no on whether they're living in a property that is owned, where the mortgage is guaranteed by Fannie and Freddie. I don't have an exact rollout date. We are working on that and trying to get that out as soon as possible. And again, that's something that's never been done before. And want to emphasize that the requirement for the landlord is, if you are in this forbearance period, as a requirement of forbearance, the landlord is prohibited from evicting any tenants for non-payment of rent during that time. And we wanted to make sure, again, that those requirements are in place. We want to make sure that we have this lookup tool in place as fast as we can. I really do applaud the efforts that you and others have went through to try to put together local information. And we hope to have that out very soon. I do want to emphasize, with those for additional questions and details on all this program, I would direct you to our FHFA.gov. We've got a coronavirus website. I would also direct you to CFPB's information. Both Fannie and Freddie have renter hotlines that are also listed at those pages, and happy to give people the phone numbers for that. I also want to emphasize we've done a number of things on the mortgage side to be able to continue to have social distancing, whether it's streamlined appraisals, employment verifications. We wanted to try to keep the mortgage market going for as much as we can. Let me also mention, one of the things I've heard often is that because there's pressure on the servicers financially, that servicers have been unwilling to essentially follow the law. And let me first say, we monitor on a daily basis the financials of Fannie and Freddie's counterparty servicers. We are seeing no servicer who is unable to meet their obligations of the law. So any servicer that is out there telling anybody that they have to pay it all back at once, so they're not eligible, and they're saying that in reference to a Fannie and Freddie loan, is giving false information. And we also, to make sure that we did not get in a situation where servicers were stressed, placed a 4-month limit on mortgage servicers' obligations so that we can make sure that they'd be able to continue to have liquidity and meet the needs. We've also tried to make sure that if loans that went into forbearance but were not yet delivered to Fannie and Freddie have caused some liquidity needs and some stress in the mortgage market, we last week announced a program where those loans can be sold to Fannie and Freddie. Again, so trying to deal with a number of steps across the mortgage market, trying to make sure that we can keep people in their homes within the limited authorities that we have. So again, emphasizing first thing that renters should do is talk to their landlord. Their landlord will be able to know whether they've got a Fannie Freddie mortgage. It's the landlord's choice, so we don't have the legal authority to force landlords into this program that don't want to be in this program. But if the landlord requests forbearance, we will be granting it. Does not need to be documented. The landlord simply needs to request it. And the understanding is the landlord is prohibited from engaging in any evictions during that time. So with that, Diane, let me try to answer any questions you have.
Great, thanks so much, Mark. I really appreciate that. I appreciate you being on the call, and also just want to say how much we appreciated your early leadership in finding ways to protect tenants from evictions through mortgages that were backed by Fannie and Freddie. I think you're right that the leadership and the actions that you took kind of paved the way for Congress to follow suit and have those similar broader eviction and foreclosure moratoriums. So I appreciate that. One quick clarification, is the mortgage forbearance available for owner-occupied 1 to 4 unit properties?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
So again, as I mentioned, as you know, about a third of renters are in single-family units, and that includes obviously duplexes, townhouses, row houses, and such. All of those are eligible. We have seen that uptake. So I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but we have seen a significant number of the single-family forbearances that have been granted are on rental properties.
Okay, interesting, thanks. It would be helpful if you would, if afterwards maybe we could follow up to get those numbers from you. That would be very helpful. I also wanted to ask, so you mentioned that the single family properties, a third of all renters live in the single family properties. You also talked about the lookup tool that Fannie and Freddie and FHFA are working on. We've had multiple conversations about that. I appreciate the work that's happening at both of the enterprises related to that. As you probably know, NLHC went ahead and took the publicly available data from Fannie, Freddie, HUD, USDA, Treasury, VA, and created a database that has already prevented a couple dozen illegal evictions that we've heard of. But the data aren't complete. One, it doesn't include all of the multifamily properties, but also, I think most importantly, it doesn't include those single family properties. So are the tools that Fannie and Freddie and you at FHFA working on, will those include the single family rental properties as well?
Our hope is eventually they will. The first round, we're focusing on the multifamily. So again, all of this stuff is very new. So yes is the end game.
Okay, because as I've said to you and others, I think there's real urgency behind making those data public, because especially for the single family properties that are owned by the larger corporations, I think some of those tenants are most at risk of potentially illegal eviction. So just would continue to urge you to get those data out as soon as possible. And I think you touched on this, but just to ask again, how many rental owners have made use of the forbearance option, or about what percentage you expect to request forbearance?
So I'm going to give you a couple of numbers with the caveat that these numbers are changing, growing every day. Certainly one of the things that we've seen is while there was fairly quick uptake and people seem to know about the single family, it took a long time, so the multifamily data is still growing. So I just say that with the caveat. I'm going to give you some numbers, accept that those numbers are going to be very different over time. And also accept that what I'm going to give you is number of properties and the number of units. And right now, so far, we're only able to collect number of units in a property. And obviously, that's a upper bound, if you will. Not everybody in those units is receiving assistance. We are in the process of putting together some surveys so that we can actually figure out of those units how many renters are actually receiving assistance. So with that in mind, we've had so far just under 600 properties representing just under 50,000 rental units in the multifamily side. And to really kind of put a sense on this, and they have been heavily concentrated New York, New Jersey areas that have been heavily impacted. So out of those 50,000 units that are being covered, you know, and again, I will really say, I only do this because we're friends and I think it's helpful to give you a guesstimate, but I really want to underline it is a guesstimate with a big margin of error, that what we think we see provided so far is probably about 15 to 25,000 renters themselves are directly receiving assistance to this. Out of those 50,000 units is what we think we're seeing so far.
Okay, I'm sorry, Mark, did you say 50,000 or 60,000?
So 50,000 units
Okay.
are in about the 600 some properties.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I want to emphasize the data we get so far is we get the unit, we get the number of property, we get the property, we get the number of units. You know, in many of these areas, we are seeing, you know, maybe 30%, 40% of renters aren't making payments, but that's going to differ by property. And so I really do want to emphasize those are very preliminary numbers. They will absolutely change, but I thought it was more helpful to give you a sense of what we're seeing today, even if that's going to change considerably.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. We'll certainly keep in mind that those are preliminary and guesstimates. Appreciate you sharing them. And I know you're about out of time, so I just wanted to ask or urge one more thing of you, Mark, and that is that we have been hearing from renters and from legal aid attorneys about an alarming number of evictions that are moving forward despite the moratoriums. And clearly these are illegal. The law makes clear that the renters are protected, but I do think a statement from FHFA reminding owners that they are obligated to follow the law and protect renters when their properties fall under the moratoriums would go a long way. So I'd urge you to consider that, making such a statement.
Absolutely, we would be happy to do that. And while we aren't a law enforcement agency, we can discipline the servicers. We can't discipline the landlords, but obviously disciplining the servicers will put some pressure on the landlords. If you are hearing trouble with servicers, so for instance, I've heard from a number of people where they have called on their own mortgage and feel like they've gotten disinformation. We have started a partnership with CFPB where the complaints that go to CFPB will get to us. So first I would say, if there are any lender servicer complaints, please go to CFPB, let them know about it. It'll allow that information will get back to us. It'll allow us to focus on servicers who aren't behaving responsibly. Again, we don't have enforcement authority, but ultimately we can cut these servicers off from ever doing business with Fannie and Freddie. So obviously they have a very strong incentive to work with us. And the same thing with some of the landlords. So I would say put the complaints in the CFPB. Certainly work with state and local officials as you're talking about. That's really where a lot of the enforcement has to happen. But if you get the information to CFPB and the complaints, it will get to us. And while, of course, we don't have law enforcement authority, we do have an ability to stop these entities from doing business with Fannie and Freddie.
Right, good. Good. Okay, well, thank you again, Mark. I really appreciate your good work and your leadership, and thanks so much for joining the call today.
Really my pleasure. Thank you, Dan, for all you're doing.
Thanks. Take care. Okay, now I'm going to turn to our next speaker. We're really pleased to have on the line Julián Castro, who I know many of you know well as a former presidential candidate and also a former HUD Secretary. And he's joining us today to talk about what's needed to really ensure housing stability during and after the pandemic. So Secretary Castro, I'll turn it over to you. And you might just need to make sure that your line is unmuted. Secretary Castro, are you able to hear us or unmute your line to speak? Hello? Maybe I know that he was on. I know that he is on. Just want to give it one more minute to see if we can figure out the issue. Okay. Well, I'll just ask if the NLHC team can just make sure that Secretary Castro is on as a speaker. Okay, so we'll see if we can figure out what's happening here. Oh, somebody is advising, good advice, to use *6 to unmute Julián Castro if you are still muted. We can unmute you if you've dialed in via the webinar, but otherwise you have to unmute your own phone. Okay, well, let's see if we can resolve that. And in the meantime, I'm going to turn to the next segment of our agenda, which is some of the state efforts to prevent evictions and address homelessness. And in that segment of the agenda, our first speaker is Keith Ellison, Attorney General from Minnesota, and I'm delighted to welcome Attorney General Ellison back to an NLHC call, where I know you've spent many years ago a lot of your time when you were a member of Congress and leading many of the fights to push for housing justice. So I'm delighted to have you back. And Attorney General Ellison, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, hey, I'm delighted to be here. And I remember working on several pieces of legislation with you all, and it's been fantastic. I know that others are carrying on the fight, and you know, so am I in my corner of the world. I'm also really honored to be on with my good friend Karl, Racine, Attorney General in DC, who has been a friend and a mentor. So it's great that we're here together. Let me just start by saying that according to the Minnesota Multi-Housing Association, late payments of rent have doubled from their normal rate. I know that's not a surprise to anyone, and they haven't doubled in just equally across the state of Minnesota. They've doubled and even tripled in certain concentrated parts of our community, low wealth people, communities of color, like that. So we are definitely feeling like we have to be on the forefront of this fight. The governor issued a critical executive order. Issuing this order said that it gave the Attorney General's office power to say that there will not be any evictions during the pendency of the pandemic. And this particular order has had us pretty busy, quite frankly. Many of the landlords that call us, or that we end up having we can resolve it with a telephone call or a letter. We've had numerous verbal agreements, which we then memorialize with a letter, and if they violate it, we will go straight back to court on them, and the tenants know how to find us. You know, we work with tenants, a lot of tenant education, but we've had a number of people who just have wanted to violate the executive order, and so we've had to take them to court. One case that I might mention to you involved Sandstone, Minnesota, which is rural Minnesota. It's not in Minneapolis or St. Paul, but the couple was sheltering in place with their 4-year-old daughter who had a lot of health conditions and was pretty vulnerable. And the landlord shut off the electricity because he wanted to sell the property and show it. And the family said, we can't really let anybody in because our daughter is at heightened medical risk. And so he said, well, I'll just shut off your water for that. And he left them without power, heat, or water in sub-freezing temperatures. Minnesota's just starting to experience a little spring, and so it's still cold. So this was a dramatically cruel thing to do. We sued him, brought him to court. It was reported in the press, you know, but he ended up, we brought him into compliance, kicking and screaming, quite frankly. We also had another case, also in rural Minnesota, where the owner of a manufactured housing park wanted the tenant out because he was behind on his water bill. The tenant is on furlough because of COVID-19. But despite that, the tenant made several cash payments on the bill. The landlord shut off the tenant's water 3 different occasions after being told not to. The tenant was, they tried to force him out of the house. We intervened, got a temporary injunction, stopped it, and that's the second case that guy, and we're now continuing to seek damages against him. And the third one, again, in rural Minnesota, in a duplex, the landlord owns it. The downstairs neighbors are behind on their rent, so the landlord refused to refill the propane tank, which means no cook, heat, a lot of problems. So the upstairs neighbors who are not behind on their rent, but who are on furlough because of COVID-19 complained. The landlord told them he still wouldn't refill the tank and told them to apply for public assistance for help in getting it filled. So this landlord lives in Florida, so he's not worried about Minnesota in the end of the winter, beginning of the spring. We sued him. All 3 cases, we took him to court based on the executive order. In all 3 cases, we were able to restore utilities, stop the interruption of illegal service to the house, and seek damages against these people. In all 3 cases, tenants have told us that they're really happy to get our help, and we've asked them to help us spread the word. And we have a tenant hotline up on our webpage and telephone number available, and we've been getting a steady number of calls. As I said, usually we can get people to stop their illegal eviction action with a letter. Some of them just don't understand the law or they haven't heard of it. So we've been doing a lot of education, but it benefits everybody because it allows people to shelter in place. Let me just say that in Minnesota, we have had some benefit from the CARES Act. Minnesota has received a certain percentage of those funds, and it's expected that Minnesota will receive some more, not clear how much. We've gotten some for CDBG, local and state, homeless assistance, local and state, public housing operation, tenant-based rental assistance, and housing opportunities for persons with AIDS. Not much, but some. The CARES Act has been helpful. We expect that it needs to be more helpful. Again, that previous speaker talked a lot about mortgage forbearance for owners of federally backed mortgages, and that's been helpful, but there's still a lot more to be done because not everybody has a federally backed mortgage, and we're quite concerned about what's going to happen as soon as our Minnesota eviction moratorium is lifted. In fact, we're quite concerned about it and are already trying to generate conversation locally about what we're going to do about it. I can tell you that if a huge percentage of rents were late in April, more will be late in May, more will be late in June. And it's going to put an awful lot of pressure on a lot of families. Now, it's also going to put pressure on some of these landlords who rely on the rent to pay the mortgage. And then a lot of the banks that rely on receipts from the landlords to pay their indebtedness. And so this could set off a chain that we're quite concerned about. We're trying to get ahead of it by having a conversation with people in the Financial Services Committee. And we're also trying to map out federal, state, county, and local assistance so that nobody double dips. We're quite concerned that a bank that got substantial assistance is not passing that assistance along. And so, I mean, why in the world should a bank that got assistance from the federal or state government, why would they seek an eviction as soon as they're able to? We're concerned that that could happen, but we're gonna need to have information tight and lined up. And at this point, we don't have it all, so we're working on it. Let me finally say that we are doing a number of other things to try to keep families afloat economically by holding prices down. We've done a substantial amount of prosecution of price gouging in violation of the executive order. That includes secret shopper investigations. We've had over 1,500 price gouging complaints and we've sent everything from enforcement letters to actually suing people in court, which we'll continue to do. We've also received a substantial number of scam complaints, and we're partnering with the U.S. Attorney to stop those things, scam cures, scam tests, scams, period. And sadly, we've got a number of wage theft complaints. Now, these are not complaints that they had to lay people off. These are illegal non-payment of wages that are due and owing. And so, these are, we've had numerous complaints. I mean, over 55 so far of wages illegally withheld, unpaid, or stolen. And we've been enforcing and seeking action. Last thing I want to mention is we have the JBS plant located in Minnesota. This is a meatpacking plant located in Worthington, owned by a Brazilian company, which is one of the largest in the world. And we have had a number of problems with these folks. They have shut down the plant, which in some ways is good for it to be sanitized. But we've had trouble with them letting us into letting the state into investigate to make sure they've complied fully with their cleaning efforts. We've also run into some trouble with some local hospitals in their bad treatment of nurses. And of course, Amazon is not treating its workers right. You may say, well, Keith, this is a housing call. Yes, it is. But all these people who are having trouble on the job have hopefully need to earn a living and have other parts of their life that they're trying to manage. So I thought I'd throw some of that in too. Much more to say, but I don't want to hold up Karl Racine, who is always on the forefront and is definitely a leader amongst us attorneys general. So I'll hand it back to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I do have one question for you, Attorney General Ellison, and thanks so much for all of the great work that you're doing and for sharing it on this call. But there's a question about some people seeing landlords who are asking tenants, like prospective tenants, for their COVID-19 status as part of their paperwork. And they're asking about what they should do in those cases if tenants are being asked to disclose medical conditions in order to get the apartment that they need.
Yeah, we have received those kind of complaints. We are deeply disturbed by them. We've been working with the Minnesota Department of Human Rights. We think this is clearly a violation regarding people's health status, and potential or perceived disability, and we're not standing for it. So we've been moving out on that, and we're urging people to continue to complain to us so that we can take action. So thanks for highlighting that. That is a very serious concern. We're drafting guidance on that now to try to gain compliance among everybody, and we're taking action on those few cases that we have found. Now, when I say there are few, I don't mean there's only a few, but we don't have a flood of those yet, but we're concerned that we're going to get more and more and more. And we've had landlords say, well, we know you're getting your stimulus checks, so there's been some bad behavior with regard to that as well. But thanks for mentioning that. And if you guys have guidance on what our guidance should look like, we're looking for help anywhere we can find it. Yeah,
okay, good. We will send some thoughts on that. And thank you again so much for joining and for your work. And I will turn now to Attorney General Karl Racine from the District of Columbia for you to share some remarks as well.
Hi, Diane. Thank you so much. And let me thank Keith for those really nice words. It's been a total pleasure and joy to get to know him as a great human being. My condolences to Keith on the passing of his legendary mother, a woman who worked on behalf of vulnerable young people for the better part of her life. And I know how much she imparted on Keith. The old saying is that the fruit doesn't fall too far from the tree. And that obviously is correct here, as Keith is a dedicated public servant who's taken the AG world by the storm. Keith mentioned something that I'd like to start off with, which is if you look at housing insecurity and the unaffordability of housing, and you think about evictions, you need to, of course, have read the book by Matthew Desmond, Evicted. And that book, as well as other scholarly work, identifies what the problem is. And Keith, once again, put his finger right on the nub. The income level for Americans and residents of our country over the last 20 years, inflation adjusted, has been flat. Housing prices, on the other hand, have increased by 70%. That's why in 2016, 23 million evictions occurred in our country. That's a rate of 4 evictions every minute. Evictions are not just an indication of poverty, it's actually the cause of poverty. The average age of an evicted person in the United States is under 12. And the reason for that is because the woman, overwhelmingly the mom, who was evicted has small children. So this is outrageous. And these folks who are evicted are also not what some consider to be, quote, welfare mothers and fathers, unquote. Indeed, the overwhelming majority of evicted persons work 1 or 2 jobs, and they pay 60, 70, 80% of their income towards rent. Yet that's not enough. And of course, we know that unfortunately, this impacts our vulnerable communities, which obviously includes Black and brown families disproportionately. And now we have COVID-19. And while I applaud our federal partner and the CFPB for being prepared to do what it needs to do to put the heat on servicers who are, by the way, not being evicted at all, whose income has not been flat over the last 20 years, obviously much more needs to be done because it's about to get a whole lot worse, notwithstanding laudable federal and state and local prohibitions or moratoriums on evictions. Once this COVID-19 is over, I'm happy to hear that there won't be a surge debt with months of rent immediately due. But what are these families going to be doing about their income? And once again, General Ellison hit it right. This all has to do with how much money hardworking people earn. And so I know the country has to recover economically, and we have to do everything we can in our power to give individuals, small businesses, and even large businesses the opportunity to recover. But let's not forget about those individuals, including the mothers with children, who are not going to immediately go back to a job with a 40% raise. No, they're going to be in dire straits. You better believe, unfortunately, that chances are that evictions will skyrocket. Foreclosures will skyrocket. The stain of a foreclosure and an eviction on one's credit rating, even a person working 2 and 3 jobs to support their kids, is a stain that sometimes is too much to overcome and entraps people forever in a debtor's game of rent. Let's get ahead of this. Let's use COVID-19 as an opportunity to treat all Americans in urban areas and rural areas fairly and in a just way. I have a section here to talk about the action that the Office of Attorney General has taken. I'm joined by my colleague Jen Berger, who's in our Housing and Justice Reform section, but I'm not going to go through that because General Ellison really well stated what state attorney generals on a bipartisan basis are doing in their states throughout the country. And that is they're standing up for the residents in their states. They're being the people's lawyers, working for free, not charging those lawyers, and holding those who would seek to take advantage of these circumstances accountable. What's worse? Someone who's seeking to take advantage of a circumstance that ends up with a young parent and 2 or 3 kids on the street, or a scam artist trying to take money from your parents' 401k. I think they're equally abhorrent and we've got to hold them to account by law. And that's what we're doing, and we're obviously using our bully pulpit, as I hope I just did, to advocate for the kind of change we need, which is an increase in the national minimum wage, an increase in the federal minimum wage, and a lot of supports going directly to individuals and families who need that in order to have a roof over their heads. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Attorney General Racine. Really appreciate your strong statements and your good work. And I think both you and Attorney General Ellison both made an incredibly powerful and eloquent and important case for why we need more rental assistance. And we, as everybody on this call knows, have been working with us to push for $100 billion in rental assistance in the next spending package. And I think you made a very good case for why that's so needed. But thank you again for your leadership, and thank you for joining this call.
Well, thank you for having us. Thank you.
So I think that we have fixed our technical issues, and I really appreciate Secretary Castro's perseverance and patience. So again, I want to welcome and introduce former presidential candidate, former HUD Secretary Julián Castro. I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, Diane. I hope you can hear me.
I can.
Okay, wonderful. And my apologies for the technical difficulties. I think it was on my end. I hope that everybody on this call is staying safe and staying healthy and doing well under the circumstances. I also want to thank all of the folks on the call who have spoken, Attorney General Ellison and Racine and everyone else who's going to speak, for all of the hard work I know that they're doing to make sure that especially people who are the most vulnerable out there with the most needs are served during this crisis. And I especially want to thank you, Diane, and the NLIHC and so many other organizations that are trying to ensure that people have a safe, decent, and affordable place to live. The other speakers have said this well, and all of us are living through this. We know that these are very troubling times. I'm here in San Antonio with my family, and y'all may have seen a couple of weeks ago, there was a photo that went viral. The photo was of the parking lot at a flea market on a day when the San Antonio Food Bank was distributing bags of groceries to people who needed it. And in the photo, which was taken from a drone from above, the parking lot was absolutely packed. It looked like you were looking at a mall parking lot during the holidays, or a huge traffic jam on the widest highway that we have in our country. 10,000 families got food that day. And so the depths of this, with 26 million people having gotten an unemployment notice, filed for unemployment over the last 5 or 6 weeks, the fact that so many Americans now have the rent that is coming up in a few days, and they don't know where they're going to get the money to pay for it. We know that some good work has been done by Congress. About $12.5 billion was allocated to HUD for housing concerns. Mark talked about some of the work that the FHFA, the agencies have done to try and provide relief. I know that cities and states around the country some of them have gotten very creative. I think about places like Portland that has struck up an agreement with hotels whose rooms are empty right now, to use some of that federal money and local money to ensure that homeless individuals are able to be put up in those hotel rooms. They're doing the same thing here in San Antonio, and I'm sure in a number of other communities. And so there's some very good work that is being done. But, if I had to put my finger on two things that I think we need to focus a lot on, and I want to commend the National Low-Income Housing Coalition for doing this, it's that I believe that we need much more in terms of direct rental assistance right now, and also much more aid to ensure that homeless individuals are taken care of during this time and beyond. During the campaign, a number of us proposed things like a refundable renter's tax credit, We proposed investing in eliminating homelessness in this country to ensure that we can build on the work of the Obama administration that saw a 47% reduction in veteran homelessness between 2010 and 2016. A lot of the practices and approaches that we learned were effective during that time. I think we can expand to all types of homelessness and improve what we did during that time. We also talked about the need to invest in more affordable housing units. So, you know, what I wanted to get on this call to say is that, Diane, y'all have put out a blueprint and others have put out good blueprints for what we need to do right now and what I hope Congress will continue to do as it looks at another relief package in the days ahead to address the immediate needs of people who need a safe, decent, affordable place to live, whether they're a renter right now or whether they hold a mortgage or whether they're homeless. In addition to that, if you think about the future, what's going to happen when we get out of this, and we are going to get out of it, is that the next administration is going to be faced with maybe unprecedented calls for austerity in our country. At a time when people who are the most vulnerable, their lives have been completely scrambled. And the housing affordability crisis that we had coming into this coronavirus experience, with up to 50% of people out there rent burdened. So many people paying 60 or 70% of their income already in rent. Homelessness starting to go up again in the United States over the last couple of years, especially as we saw on the West Coast and some other communities that have been hard hit by the coronavirus and exacerbated the issue. That's the challenge that we're going to have. And so I guess if I could add something to the conversation, it would be for all of the folks on this call and all of the organizations that have been working on this for a long time, and Diane, you and the coalition, you know, to thank you for providing the leadership that it takes to put the ideas out there and get the pressure going to make those investments. Let's also be thoughtful about the situation that we're going to face in January of 2021 and beyond, and the headwinds that we're going to face in making sure that we're not only able to recover from this, but also to go back and address that housing affordability crisis that was already problematic in an environment where I think overly partisan calls are going to be made for austerity in our country after all of the spending that has happened during this time frame. I believe that instead of taking our foot off the gas, we need to do what the coalition has suggested, which is to lean into it, to make these investments in the ability of every single person to find a safe, decent, affordable place to live. And I look forward to lending my voice to do that. And I want to thank you for having me on. And more than anything else, I want to thank everybody on this call for using your voice, your expertise, the passion that you have for doing for others who need us right now. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Secretary Castro. Really appreciate your leadership, and you're taking the time to join this call and share such important thoughts and guidance. It's certainly something that's on many of our minds around how we make sure that we're not just implementing the short-term immediate solutions, but we're thinking about and planning for the longer-term needs. And you've been such a leader in this space for so long, and we appreciate and look forward to your continued leadership. So thanks again. Okay, I'm going to turn now to our next section of the agenda to hear from Megan Gibbert-Klein, who is the director of Away Home America, and she's going to talk a little bit about guidance for elected officials on youth homelessness. So Megan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here. And the first thing I want to say is just as I've been listening to you all and looking at the chat box, there are so many people on this call right now that are struggling with your housing, with your basic needs. And I want to just take a moment and to honor that on the call. Thank you for being here. And I'm grateful to be here. I'm going to take just a couple of moments and pivot a bit to youth homelessness specifically on this call. What I want to lead with is that, as several of the presenters have already said, we have an opportunity to respond to this crisis in a way that deepens our equitable responses in this country. We have an opportunity to respond to this crisis in a way that builds, in particular, homeless response systems that are much more driven by equity, are much more driven by the voices of people experiencing homelessness. And so that is the opportunity in front of us, both to make it through this crisis, but to do that in a way that improves the work that we do in line with our values. Away Home America, with our partners, released guidance recently specifically for ESG administrators. So I'm going to get real geeky here for just a minute, but I promise I'll bring it back around. We are offering some advice on how ESG administrators can use those ESG dollars in part to respond to youth homelessness for a few important reasons. One, young people often carry the virus while remaining asymptomatic. Young people, because they are youth, are highly mobile. We all remember that moment if we are no longer a young person at this moment. And young people need support in finding safe, stable housing just as adults do, but in particular to social distance from more vulnerable populations. So there's some reasons in this moment in particular to consider if we also have tailored responses to youth homelessness as part of our emergency response in communities. We'll note that in the CARES Act, there was emergency funds included for runaway homeless youth programs. Those funds were $25 million. It's not sufficient in and of themselves to respond to the crisis in every community, and many communities don't have RHY programs. So that's part of the response, but can't be the whole blanket, if you will. So I want to offer a high-level summary of the suggestions, just 4 things. Again, directly to ESG administrators or decision makers in a community. I think these also paint a picture for how local communities might advocate to those decision makers in their community and be a part of the advocacy there locally. The first is to engage youth homelessness service providers who might not be receiving ESG funding. In many communities, youth-specific providers have not pursued ESG funding in the past. So if local administrators just rely on the networks that they currently have, they are likely missing young people experiencing homelessness, again, that have particular needs in this moment. Encourage providers, second, to tailor responses to the needs of young people of color and those who identify as LGBTQ. Black and African American in some communities are 35 to 50% of those infected or more. Systemic racism has led to disproportionately high rates of COVID-19 infection and mortality among Black and African American folks in particular. And that's a population that's already disproportionately impacted by homelessness. So again, encourage providers to tailor responses explicitly to young people of color and those who identify as LGBTQ. I'm noticing in the chat, again, so many people who have experienced homelessness. One of our recommendations is to invite young people with lived experiences to have input into the decision making and trust and rely on those with lived experiences to give you an unvarnished view of your decisions. In all of the work that we do involving those that have experienced or are experiencing homelessness is a way to really truth the work that we're doing. And finally, we're asking administrators to leverage waivers. There is a ton of flexibility that is possible in this moment. The Youth Homelessness Demonstration Project, thank you, Julián Castro, for your leadership in that program when it started, offers some ways to do that in communities that have already been tested. Certainly there are things like extending length of stay and rapid rehousing and removing barriers around parental consent. Those are some options. Finally, I want to say that there was a process that led to the development of this guidance, and I'll put a link in the chat box here. What was different about that process with all of these partners is that young people who lived experience of homelessness were part of the folks who drafted this guidance, specifically the National Youth Forum on Homelessness. If you don't know them, look them up. They're incredible national leaders and members of Away Home America's leadership body, which is over half young people with lived experiences of homelessness. Again, I'm so glad to be here. I think, humbled by the need present in the call and in the chat box and in the questions. And to all of us on the call, I would just underscore what other presenters have said, which is we have an opportunity to move towards more equitable systems in our communities. We have an opportunity to move toward more equitable responses. And that means taking this moment, talking explicitly to people who have experienced homelessness, and really grounding our response in what will work best for those who are most likely to need that response.
Thanks very much, Megan. Really important guidance that you've shared with us all. I really appreciate it. And we had a number of people send comments about how much they appreciate your comments and appreciate the materials that you're sending. So thanks again. And for folks who are looking for some of the materials that Megan referenced, she's put links in the chat box, so you can check there, and we'll also include them in the follow-up materials that we send out. Thanks, Megan.
Thanks, Diane.
We'll turn now to field updates, and we'll hear first from Cristina Rosales, who's Deputy Director at Texas Housers. Cristina, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks Diane, and thanks everybody for having us on the call to represent Texas. In just a few minutes, Governor Greg Abbott is making an announcement about slowly reopening up the state for business. This is questionable because it is unknown whether testing will ramp up to keep up with the severity of the virus. Meanwhile, the Texas Supreme Court has stayed eviction proceedings across the state until April 30th, so that's this Thursday. And we have been working with local officials to urge the Supreme Court justices to extend the stay for longer and preferably to line up with the timeline stated in the CARES Act protections for renters. In the meantime, as Secretary Castro mentioned, localities are trying to do their best and pass their own ordinances, including the city of Austin and the city of Dallas, which are allowing 60-day opportunity to cure periods and prohibiting landlords from posting notices to vacate, which those notices that precede the eviction proceedings can be really scary for tenants. So we want to make sure that tenants aren't leaving their apartments before they have to. The city of San Antonio is, from what we understand, still weighing whether this local ordinance is a possible policy that they could pursue. But from what we know, there's just not enough consensus on the council about the best way forward. An interesting thing that's happening in Travis County, which is the county where Austin is JP courts are requiring an affidavit from landlords that their properties are not covered by the CARES Act moratorium. And then several cities, including Austin, Dallas, and San Antonio, have passed emergency rental relief funds, ranging from about $13 million to $25 million. They're using existing tax funds as well as their already their existing federal allocations. The city of Houston has still failed to take any local action related to rental assistance or local tenant protection measures. And that's, the fourth largest city in the country. So this is very concerning for us. And then I just wanted to provide an update about what we've been hearing with our work directly from tenants. And that's that a lot of folks are still getting pressure from landlords to pay up immediately, despite being protected from through the federal protections. And then they're also threatening to tow residents' cars with expired inspection stickers, which is very concerning. And then just a little bit of bright side kind of news. Texas Housers had been hearing early on in the crisis that some tenants we work with were having trouble getting supplies and groceries because they live in food deserts and they rely on Dollar Tree or gas station stores. And some vendors came in and provided 200-300% markup, advertising that they take SNAP benefits, and we thought that that was essentially price gouging, so we reported it, but we also educated legislators about the issue and helped residents write a letter to the governor requesting online purchasing for using SNAP benefits. And 45 legislators signed on to a letter, and 25 tenants sent their own letter to the governor asking to gain access to the online purchasing. And last week on Monday, Texas was approved for that, for the online pilot using SNAP benefits to purchase groceries. We have plenty more updates, but I'm out of time. So thank you very much, y'all, for including us on the call.
Thanks, Cristina. Great work on the SNAPs piece, and thanks for sharing some of the really significant challenges that you're facing too, so we can consider solutions at the federal level. So thank you, Cristina. And our next field update is going to be from Cody Glazer from Florida Housing Coalition. Cody, I'll turn it over to you. Cody, you might be muted. We can't hear you.
Thanks, Diane. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, now I can.
Great. Hi, everyone, and thanks again for having me on today. So here at the Florida Housing Coalition, helping organizations implement rental assistance programs has been one of our top priorities. Florida is unique in that we have a state and local affordable housing trust fund. And so each year, our housing trust fund dollars are sent to local governments directly to administer what's called the SHIP program. And the SHIP program is generally a homeownership program, but fortunately under our state's emergency declaration, our state housing finance agency has waived various statutory set-asides so that local governments can spend more of their funds on emergency rental and mortgage assistance. And so we work closely with our Florida Housing Finance Corporation to provide training and TA to local governments so that we can help them amend their plans, their policies, so they can deploy these rental assistance funds quickly. And so there have been two main issues that we've seen with rental assistance here on the ground. The first being, available resources. Preaching to the choir, but the need really is so great here. And the amount of money really depends on where you are in the state. And it has been a real challenge trying to direct folks to the right place to get aid. So you might have some local governments here that have up to $800,000 to spend on rental assistance, while another county of the same size may only have $60,000, for example. So for example, like one of our larger counties, Hillsborough County, has been able to use $15 million in general revenue for rental assistance, but other local governments may not have the same resources. And this is why the leadership you all have been doing about the $100 billion for rental assistance is so important. So like, for example, last Thursday, the city of Fort Myers here announced the creation of a rental assistance program, and it was fully subscribed within 24 hours. And we've seen that happen several times across the state already. And so the second issue we've seen with rental assistance is in the implementation of these programs. So frankly, there are many local governments that have never done a rental assistance program before, but want to do so with their CDBG, ESG, and other funds. So if they decide to do it in-house, they have to create a whole new system on the fly. And so to this end, we are encouraging local governments to contract out with existing nonprofits that have experience in rental assistance. Some are deciding to do them in-house, which just takes extra time. And so we're working with folks on how to get this money out quickly. Briefly on the eviction front, their evictions are on pause statewide in Florida until May 17th. And so if the statewide moratorium is not extended, we'll be going back to the piecemeal effort based on circuit court jurisdiction. Our worry, like it is in Texas, is that if the state reopens too soon, the governor may not feel the need to extend our eviction moratorium, even though many will still face the possibility of eviction. And so we're working with our legal services partners on that front. About half of our 67 counties have applied for or have been approved for non-congregate sheltering. This is obviously critical to getting people experiencing homelessness off the street to help decompress our emergency shelters. Florida has a state office on homelessness that administers ESG and other state funding specific to homelessness. They'll be allocating the ESG CV funding to our 27 COC lead agencies in Florida. The state's also coordinating weekly calls with COC lead agencies, our Division of Emergency Management, and the State Office on Homelessness to discuss unmet needs and challenges. And so one last wrinkle that I'll share today is that we are starting to plan for the awful possibility of an active hurricane season here. And so our Division of Emergency Management has a weekly call on sheltering plans and is beginning to form an eviction task force statewide. And through this task force, of which we are a part of, we are working to connect these county emergency operations centers to housing departments, because far too often during hurricane season, we see these departments operating in their own silos. And now it may be more important than ever for our housing staffers to be connected with our emergency operations people, because housing as healthcare really does take on a whole new meaning when hurricanes are involved. There's a lot more going on in Florida, but I'll leave that for another time. And thanks again for having me on, and thanks for everyone for all that you do.
Great, thanks, Cody. That was a great report. And hurricane season has been top of mind for us too at the coalition. It's for those who don't follow it obsessively like some of us do. Hurricane season starts on June 1st, and there are, of course, tremendous concerns and challenges about what it would look like if there were to be a significant hurricane during COVID-19. And I think to Cody's point, it'll be more important than ever that we're staying really closely connected on the challenges and solutions at that time as well. And that's something else that we've been talking about in our Working with FEMA working groups, and we'll continue to. Also just wanted to note that both Cody and Christina have talked about local rental assistance programs that are being created with either state and local dollars or some of the new funding that was provided through the CARES Act. And there's lots of both challenges and opportunities that arise from that. That's something that we talked about on last week's state and local implementation call. We'll continue to talk about that. And there are some other efforts from some partner organizations to really kind of dig into what are the best practices at the local level to share with others as they begin to implement rental assistance programs. So much more to come on that work too. So now I'm going to turn to our third field update for today, and that's from Bambi Hayes Brown with Georgia Advancing Communities Together, or Georgia ACT. So Bambi, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks for being on today.
Yes, Diane, thank you so much for having Georgia ACT on the call to give the update from the field from Georgia. As most of you know, Governor Kemp, in his race to be first, and some may say in his race to be last, began opening up some businesses on this past Friday, including some salons, barbershops, tattoo parlors, and today sit-down restaurants and theaters. And this was done without conferring with the mayors of a lot of our major cities, including the city of Atlanta, the city of Savannah, as well as the city of Albany. And Georgia was not experiencing the downward trend, even as recommended by our president. So Governor Kemp did open up some businesses starting this past Friday. And there's been a lot of discussion about the reason why those businesses were open so quickly was because back in March, 1 in 10 Georgians filed for unemployment, which was equal to about 1 million Georgians, and it really overwhelmed the system. And so there were several people who were not, previously were not experiencing housing problems, health and economic issues, were now faced with those issues. And those who were already experiencing those issues, the pandemic really made their situation worse. So back on April the 1st, our partners Georgia Appleseed, the Atlanta Volunteer Lawyers Foundation, and the Georgia Healthy Housing Coalition, in which Georgia ACT is a member, did submit to Governor Kemp a letter, a moratoria for evictions and foreclosures for the state. There are over 130 organizations that signed and supported those efforts. And our governor has not taken any action on that yet. So we have been encouraging all of our organizations and members and friends and constituents in Georgia to contact Governor Kemp to enact that as an executive order. Additionally, the Georgia NAACP has also sent a separate letter to request a moratoria on evictions and foreclosures, as well as to overturn the decisions to open up businesses. And another one of Georgia ACT's partners, Georgia Watch, has been very active in really advocating for not having utility shutoffs in the state. And proud to say Georgia Power has really been a leader in that effort in not having utility shutoffs. And because of that, they have really encouraged others who are not governed by the Georgia Public Service Commission. We do have a lot of other municipalities that have local-owned utilities and EMCs, and so they have really followed Georgia Power's lead, so we're thankful for that. We've also been hearing that debt collectors have been trying to garnish people's stimulus payments, so we've been hearing that quite a bit, and I know some of our partners have been actively engaging the Georgia Attorney General, Karl, as well as our legal partners have been very engaged in that work. Also, we do have a state housing trust fund for the homeless. I was on that call last week along with Georgia ACT's legislative analyst, Elizabeth Apley, and Elizabeth did make a comment to really urge the governor to take an action on the eviction moratoria. So we're hoping to get some type of traction with some of the members on the State Housing Trust Fund for the homeless, who also serve on the governor's task force subcommittee for homelessness. And so just around the state, DeKalb County, they were the first to implement hazard pay for its employees, followed by the city of Atlanta and other municipalities. The city of Atlanta also created funds for sheltering the homeless, as well as DeKalb County. And we've had a outpouring of efforts from our philanthropic community to create funds for agencies to apply for COVID relief. And we're also collecting stories. I know with some of our legal partners, as well as our partners from the Center for Community Change, have been collecting stories of evictions due to COVID. And we're seeing a lot of people who are affected by extended stay hotels. That is a serious gap that is missing in all the moratorium talk on the federal level that we see, somewhat on the state level. That was one of the things that I pushed for because they don't have the same protections as your traditional tenant. And so we want to thank the National Low Income Housing Coalition for awarding Georgia Act some funds to help with rent relief, and we are prioritizing those families who are at extended stay hotels, who have the least amount of protections, and those who are staying in your naturally occurring affordable housing that is not backed by any type of government funding. And as stated before, Georgia has been experiencing some natural disasters. We've had 3 natural disasters over the last 10 days, 5 hurricanes, tornadoes that came through South Georgia as well as North Georgia. The governor did come out and visit Adel, Georgia, who experienced much damage to homes and businesses with the tornadoes. And I will end with, I want to just encourage activists and academians to include your people who have lived experience and those people who are housing practitioners in your decision making, and when you're writing these policies and when you're writing these grants and those types of things, please include those with lived experience and those housing practitioners, because their voices are important too. Too many times their voices are dismissed. As we passed around a video by Cleveland King on the voices from the city of Albany, who has been hit by the largest or the most deaths in the state of Georgia. They feel that their voices have been left out and have been left out intentionally, but people are using their tragedy and the things that they're going through to benefit everyone but the people that they're supposed to benefit. So we want to encourage people to definitely include those with lived experience and those housing practitioners in your policy making and in your activist efforts. Thank you.
Bambi, thanks so much. That was an excellent report of really, really good and important work that you're doing in Georgia. So thanks so much for your great work and your leadership, and thanks for joining today. So now we're going to talk about some of the federal policy recommendations and the needed advocacy and what's ahead. We are moving now into a time where our advocacy is going to be incredibly important in order for us to achieve the policy recommendations that we've been talking about at length on multiple calls. Congress is turning its attention now to the next spending package, and this is our opportunity to get big investments in rental assistance for low-income people, as well as more funding for homeless service providers and housing providers and more. So last week, we've heard a couple times from Chairwoman Maxine Waters herself and from her staff, and on their leadership around pushing forward rental assistance in the next spending package. Last week, we heard from Elaine Weiss, who is a senior counsel for House Financial Services Committee, and she described some of the proposals that Chairwoman Maxine Waters is pushing for in this next spending bill. And the package that she described, which Chairwoman Waters has since publicly announced, includes the $100 billion in rental assistance that we have talked about, as well as at least $10 billion in new Section 8 vouchers for about 500,000 people to have housing stability during and after the pandemic. So as we get ready to gear up for our advocacy, I want to make sure that we're all clear on what the proposals are that we're pushing for, so that we can make the best case possible. So first I'm going to turn it to Will Fisher, who's a Senior Director for Housing Policy and Research at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, for Will to talk a little bit more about the proposal for $10 billion for Section 8 vouchers. Will, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Diane. So we strongly agree that it's important to provide a large number of emergency housing vouchers as part of the response. We think that should be along with a lot of other things, including funding for homelessness assistance, additional funding for existing rental assistance programs like public housing, and also a large investment in short-term rental assistance through the Emergency Solutions Grant. But we think that there's a really pressing need for the kind of sustained rental assistance that vouchers provide. As a lot of folks have talked about, this pandemic is having a disproportionate impact on low-income people and people of color. And a significant part of that is because of housing conditions that vouchers are well suited to address. So most clearly that people who are homeless are not able to maintain social distance during the pandemic. There are a lot of people who are in housing, but that isn't adequate for them to shelter in place for months on end, and that includes people in overcrowded housing or substandard housing with hazards like lead, or people who are in housing arrangements where they're exposed to violence. And these are all people who should be given the choice to move to safe, stable housing, and vouchers are a really good way to do that. There are also people who are just who are losing their jobs and are going to struggle to afford a housing and may struggle to regain employment even as the economy starts to recover, and those folks also are going to need sustained assistance. And there are people, including a lot of folks who are experiencing homelessness, who are getting temporary assistance. But we think that isn't enough, because it's going to set up a cliff where that assistance will shut off, and then people will be pushed back into unsafe and inadequate housing arrangements. For people, we think it just makes sense to provide a lot of these more vulnerable people with vouchers from the start. There's a large body of research showing that vouchers are really effective at reducing homelessness and housing instability. The program has a lot of capacity. There's 2,200 state and local housing agencies around the country who could ramp up quickly. It's been used effectively in disasters like earthquakes and hurricanes, so we know it works in emergency situations. There are particular challenges to doing vouchers in the pandemic, but HUD already has been issuing a lot of waivers, like of things like inspection requirements to make sure that it can work in this context, and they have authority to do more of that if needed. So we think it's a really an important tool here. There's one concern, political concern that could come up, is that people may be concerned that providing sustained rental assistance will increase federal costs further down the road. And we think that a pretty straightforward answer to that, if necessary, to address those political concerns, would be to make these sunsetting vouchers, so that when the family that's using them doesn't need them anymore and leaves the program, they would terminate rather than being reissued to another family, which would ensure that there wouldn't be any permanent increase in federal costs. But we do think that this is a really important component of the response to the pandemic. We're not proposing to provide vouchers to everyone who's eligible for them, but what we think is important is to provide a really large but manageable pool of vouchers that housing agencies could target on the people who most need sustained rental assistance, and that could make a really big difference for some of the most vulnerable people in the country. So I will close with that. Thanks a lot.
Great, thank you, Will. And we've had some questions about timing for the bill, what's next, how do people engage? So for that, I'm going to turn to Sarah Sadian from the National Low Income Housing Coalition to talk about strategy, tactics, and how you can all get involved in our efforts to push these recommendations forward. Sarah?
Great, thank you. So the latest we've heard is that Senate is still on track to return the week of May 4th, which means that is the soonest that we'll see a large comprehensive response to coronavirus, the next package. Democrats are already getting the process started of negotiations. We hear that Speaker Pelosi may unveil the broad outlines of what Democrats will be pushing for as soon as tomorrow or later this week. While we expect that housing and homelessness might be on the priority list for Democrats, it's not very clear about how high up on the list of priorities it falls. And so we know that Democrats, maybe their number one priority is dollars for states and local governments. And they have a lot of other things on their list of priorities, money for elections, for food assistance, for expanding unemployment insurance, for the Postal Service. We have a lot of work to do to make sure that housing and homelessness resources are as high up on that list as possible. Republicans, on the other hand, are pushing back and pushing back hard. They're much more interested in getting the economy restarted by lifting the stay-at-home orders or encouraging states to lift the stay-at-home orders and getting back to business as usual. Senator McConnell has even said that states should declare bankruptcy rather than Congress providing additional support to state and local governments. But I will say that privately, there's more of an acknowledgement around among Senate Republicans that another bill will be needed, especially if the economy continues to be hurt. Some Republicans, especially those who are facing tough re-elections, are most likely to be pushing for a bill even behind the scenes, and that includes Tillis from North Carolina, Daines from Montana, Gardner from Colorado, and Maine, Collins from Maine. So if you live in those states, I'll say them again, you might want to continue to push for your Republican senators. So that's Tillis from North Carolina, Daines from Montana, Gardner from Colorado, and Collins from Maine. In our meetings with Republican senators, we found that very few of them are willing to push publicly for housing and homelessness resources, but that doesn't mean that they're willing to do things behind the scenes. So it's really important to continue to engage with Republican offices. We do know that Senator Portman, who recently introduced the Eviction Crisis Act, says that emergency rental assistance is one of his priorities that he'll be pushing for because he sees it as being really similar to the proposal in his Eviction Crisis Act, and so he wants to see that move forward. But I will say that even though people are acknowledging that there will be some the division between Republicans and Democrats in terms of starting points for negotiations is really set far apart. And so we're expecting a long and difficult process for what will hopefully become reaching a final agreement. And as Diane had mentioned a little earlier and Will Fisher had spoken to also, there's some more appetite on the Hill for looking at beyond the most immediate needs for renters and people experiencing homelessness. Democrats are, it seems, more open to talking about longer-term vouchers or sunsetting vouchers like the ones that we're supporting along with Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Right now, the conversation has not really turned to a broader infrastructure package, but we're paying really close attention to this. If it's possible to receive infrastructure dollars, which again, it seems like a long shot considering where Republicans are starting from, then we will definitely let you all know. NLHC has been pushing for broad investments to help build and preserve affordable homes for people with the greatest needs. And so if there's an opportunity for infrastructure investments, we'll be pushing for dollars for public housing repair, for the National Housing Trust Fund, for tribal and rural housing, among many other resources as well. Right now, most of our attention, again, is on making sure that there's $11.5 billion in additional resources for people experiencing homelessness and for homeless service providers, as well as the $100 billion emergency rental assistance proposal from Senator Brown and Representatives Waters and Heck, as well as at least $10 billion for the sunsetting vouchers that Will spoke about earlier today. So we need all of you to push for these resources in the next bill. If you can, continue to reach out to your senators and representatives to let them know about what the most urgent needs are in your community and push for these solutions. We have a long couple of weeks ahead of us, but I think we're likely to start seeing things moving soon. And so the more you're engaged with your members of Congress, the better. When you reach out to them, just a tip, it'd be really helpful for you to ask them to weigh in with House and Senate leadership rather than asking them to join on to any particular bill. A lot of these proposals are happening behind the scenes, being tweaked, being discussed. And so getting onto a particular piece of legislation is less important than pushing for the idea of emergency rental assistance or the idea of additional dollars for homeless service providers. So I just wanted to flag that for you guys as you're doing your work. And with that, I'll say we're also having a legislative or policy working group call. We have that every Tuesday at 12:30. If you're interested in participating, you can register at the link that's provided in the chat box. This information is also available on our website, and we'll be talking about not just what's happening at the federal level, but also sharing best practices of advocacy, the work that's being happening at the state and local level. And with that, I'll turn it back to Diane.
Great, thanks so much, Sarah. And just to underscore what Sarah said about the big moment that we have before us and just how hard we're all going to have to work and how closely we're going to have to work together to be able to achieve the kind of big investments that we know are needed. We have many, many obstacles in front of us, which I am certain we can overcome, but only if we're really well aligned and being as active and engaged as possible over the next several weeks until this next spending bill, possibly the last spending bill, gets over the finish line. So, and also just to underscore, there's a number of questions coming in about bill numbers. And as Sarah said, you know, Congress has not officially, they've officially been out of session over the last several weeks. So bills are not being introduced to the degree they usually are. So rather than focusing on a bill number when you call your member of Congress, focus on the priorities that we're pushing and focus on the congressional leaders that are championing them, such as Chairwoman Waters, Congressman Heck, Senator Brown. As Sarah said. Also just want to remind everybody about the upcoming calls we have this week. Tonight at 6 o'clock, we have our next Tenant Talk live call. We invite all low-income renters and resident leaders to join that call. As Sarah said, tomorrow at 12:30 is the Legislative Working Group call, where we'll dig in a little bit more into the specific tactics and next steps on advocating for these policy proposals. Also tomorrow at 3, we have our Working with FEMA Working Group call. And that's where we'll continue talking about how to get FEMA to fund non-congregate shelters for people experiencing homelessness. And tomorrow we're going to talk about some of the discrepancies that we're seeing between states and how we can get some alignment and how we can push FEMA to do more and to do it more uniformly. And then on Wednesday at 3, we have our regular state local implementation working group call. On the agenda for this week is state and local programs for undocumented immigrants, ways nonprofit housing advocacy or developer organizations are using SBA loans, and the latest on waivers from HUD, USDA, Treasury, both what's already out there and what's needed. So if you have additional ideas about what you'd like to discuss during those working group calls, reach out to any of us at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. You have the links for how to sign up for those calls in the chat box on our website, and we'll send it out as follow-up information to everybody who registered for today's call. And this call, like all of our Monday weekly calls, are recorded and we put them up on our website, usually within 24 hours. So you can listen again or share it with others to listen to the speakers that we heard from today. So thanks again for all of our terrific speakers on today's call. Thank you all for joining the call, and mostly thank you all for your incredible work at the local level. I know that this has been just a tremendous effort by so many of you, and I know that it is some of the hardest circumstances that any of us have worked within in terms of the magnitude and the scale and the duration of this disaster. But we are making progress. We'll continue to make progress together, and we'll continue together to really highlight the needs of the lowest income and the most marginalized people to ensure that we get the resources necessary so that they are not left behind in this disaster. So thanks again, everybody. We'll talk to you all again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.